Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Today I'm delighted because I have returned to Andrew Johnson's study. Hooray! And we're here to talk about Edgar Fouche, who was an avionics engineer. He worked for the US Air Force and he was also a contractor to the US Air Force. And he worked in his role between, well, from the early 1970s, or was it late 60s, Andrew, when he started?
Yeah, essentially late 60s.
Late 60s up to the mid 90s. As I say, as an avionics electronics engineer, and he worked on lots of different technologies pertaining to covert aircraft that were developed by various companies for the US Air Force, and he was a key figure in the development of a lot of technologies. As I said, he had a long career, and he also worked at Area 51, which he's proven with lots of documents that he's released. Now, Andrew's just finished a series of very lengthy Skype interviews with Ed Fouche, and we're going to talk about the information in those interviews today. And we're also going to talk about some of the lectures that Ed gave in 1998 about the technologies that he was given information on. So just tell us, Andrew, how did you find out about Edgar Fouche, and how did you get into these lengthy discussions with him?
Well, that was basically because I'd been looking at the anti-gravity sort of research and technology following my discovery of the Disclosure Project in 2003. So by 2004 I'd started looking to this, what's this anti-gravity stuff, is there anything in it, and what's the information that's available about that. And I came across a presentation which was done in 1998, although at the time I think I got confused and I thought it was done in 2001, of this chap called Edgar Fouche, and he was talking about this flying triangle, which we'll talk about later, and I thought, that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I found literally some text and some images from this presentation, and he talked about some very specific bits of information, which again we're going to probably cover a little bit here. And then I found out that he'd actually been featured in a Channel 4 documentary in 1999, which I'd actually recorded. Mm-hmm. So I went back to my video archive and I found this and I watched it on VHS, and there he was for a couple of minutes talking about this work in Area 51. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first time that I actually heard his name and realised who he was.
Right. Now you've got recorded round about 6 hours of interviews with Edgar Fouche. Anyone who wants to watch the full interviews can watch it from this link on the screen now, and also on that page there's about an hour and a half long lecture featuring Edgar Fouche, and also there's the clip from the Channel 4 program as well. So anyone who wants to spend several hours on this can do it from these links. Now, just summarise for us, Andrew, his career from the early 70s through to the mid 90s. Just tell us the key places, because he worked at a lot of different secret facilities, didn't he?
Drafted from college during the Vietnam conflict, and he went into pararescue, which was like a sort of rescue team within the Air Force, and they would go in and actually try and rescue people that were injured in combat and this sort of thing. But he was only in there about a week, and he injured his ankle, mm-hmm. or a month I think he was in, so he had to come out. And so he went back to college, and he got into working with cryptographic technologies, code making, code breaking, and he sort of ended up in doing different schools at college, different courses on cryptographics, on electronics, on avionics. He did multiple different courses, and when I spoke to him, he said most people did like 2 or 3 courses, and then they went into a field and they would then just work in that field for the rest of their career. But somehow he ended up, because I think he had something of a thirst for knowledge, he ended up doing lots of different courses and gaining lots of different experience. And he also made a bit of a name for himself, because one of the key stories that he told me is, well, 2 key stories, mm-hmm. was one where he was doing some in a cryptographic school, and he basically realised that there were like about 30 codes which you could use to unlock this system, which was talking to an aircraft for transmitting some type of signal. And he learned all of these 30 codes, and in the class he said, I can crack this code immediately. Mm-hmm. And he'd learned all the test codes, basically. There's about 30 of them. Mm-hmm. And And he showed his teacher, and he said, right, I'm just going to make up a random code now. And he put another. He said he was putting a random code in, and that code worked. And the teacher says, blimey, how did you do that? You know.
Right.
And then that all went higher up.
He'd read the back of the manual and remembered it, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, he'd remembered an unusually large number of test codes, which nobody else had done. So it looked like he could crack it just with telepathy or whatever, you know, or something. And that got him attention higher up. You know, that's what
he was then visited by someone, possibly from the NSA or somewhere.
Yeah, like something like that. Yeah. And so he was kind of earmarked, and they realised, you know, that he was pretty hot on what he was doing. And he was also getting more and more well qualified. And so that really, he gained a reputation for being very good at problem solving. He was one of these people, he told me, for example, that he did a psychometric test, and it came out that he was very good with what they call abstract logic, where they can describe a problem, and then, you know, your brain works on it in the background, and then, you know, you can think of the solution very quickly. He was very good at that. He was very intuitive about working out solutions. And he mentioned that he would get called into various programs when they were going wrong, and he would get people around him, sort out all the problems, and get things back on track. And over a period of years, he developed a very strong reputation for that.
So just some of the areas or facilities that he's worked at: Edwards Air Force Base, Area 51, and
Groom Lake,
Groom Lake.
He calls it.
And the other thing about him is that he's produced more documents to validate his story than anyone, really.
That's essentially one of the things that you know, he shows us, and it does separate him from a lot of the other witnesses that have come forward. He said that he kept 900 documents with him. You know, and I mean, the selection that he showed me and are in the videos show that he's taken all these courses in avionics, and they're signed by a lieutenant or a general at the bottom to say that he's got these qualifications. So he was therefore qualified to work in these areas. And as he said, if people were going to work on black programs, they would take the best people, you know, the ones that were best qualified, that could get the job done, that had a wide range of skills. They would handpick these people. And as he said, he was also useful because he built up a team of people around him with similar skills, and he would try and employ those people in projects when he was sent onto a new aircraft, for example, to work on a new aircraft.
Now, he started out working for the Air Force, yes? And then at some point he became a contractor to the Air Force. Do you know what year that was?
I believe he became a contractor in around about the mid-80s, I think.
Right. Now, when he was a contractor, as he went up the ranks further, he was working directly under a two-star general or something like that. So one step from the top, really. He would be above the rank of major and wing commander and that kind of thing.
In certain ways, yeah, because when things have gone wrong, you know, I think there's one of the stories he mentions in the interviews we did, when things were going wrong, and there was a general that he was working for, who didn't want Ed to do what he was going to do with the project, and he went to his superior, and his superior said to the general, look, you do what Ed Fouche says because he will sort this out. So you just do what he says. So he got that reputation for being a problem solver, although, you know, in his rank, he was perhaps, in his official rank, he was below people. Because of the way that he was doing the work and getting jobs done, he had quite a lot of control over how projects were being done.
Now, a lot of people have asked, well, how on earth can someone disclose this kind of top secret information without retributions and without being locked up and that kind of thing? And one of the reasons is because he liaised over a lot of years with 6 other experts and pilots, and they shared information. So some of the information was not directly projects that he was involved with. Correct. It was what someone else had told him. So he can effectively disclose that because he's not directly given information from a project that he was involved with. And he also mentions that on some of the projects they overlooked signing particular things, so he was able to disclose information. That's what he alleges. So if we just come on to it says here that he had 4,000 hours of training, 50% of which was classified, so you can't reveal details of that. And he has produced documents to prove all of this. Now, he mentions 6 confidants that he had over a period of years that gradually built up information and shared information together in their time in the forces. And he lists 2 people or 3 people who were involved with the NSA, one of whom is dead. an ELINT engineer, that's electronic intelligence engineer, who was working for the NSA, an SR-71 pilot who he met, I think, at Edwards Air Force Base, another NSA guy who was involved with Vietnam, Department of Defense contractor, electronic engineer, who was also dead. So a couple of the guys who we got a lot of this information from have died, and many pilots as well who gave him information.
Yeah.
So can you just give us some background on these contacts that he built up and how they've kind of operated?
Well, as I understand from what said in the interviews, he met these people, as you said, over a period of years in various projects, because he was travelling around the country quite a lot in the US to the various Air Force bases. And he also came to the UK. He was actually came to do some work at one of the UK Air Force bases, and I asked him about that, and he was like here just for, I think, 2 nights. He flew in on a military jet, fixed whatever system or serviced it or set it up, and then he flew back to the States, and that's the only time he's been to the UK. So when he was travelling that widely, he met a lot of people with a lot of expertise, and obviously he kept in touch with a few of these who've listed there. And there was one chap in particular I remember he mentioned called Dale. That was the name he told me, was this chap, who gave him quite a lot of information. And his father was, Dale's father was career NSA, 30 years. He worked for the NSA for 30 years. And it was when they started talking and getting together, and he said they would occasionally try and meet up, and have a chat about things. They realised that there was some secret technology that was being held back from the public, and they realised what this technology was capable of. And I think they kind of, I don't know if I'm using the right expression, but they kind of developed a bit of a conscience about that, because they thought, well, if we had this technology which was available for the rest of the world and not just within the military, then we could change a lot of things. We could have a different sort of totally different world, basically. And that's when they became interested in trying to package this information somehow to disclose it to the public.
The TR3B is probably the most notable thing that he's released information on, that he got information from a pilot and possibly other sightings as well, when he was at Groom Lake and various other places, which we will come on to. But we're going to talk initially about some of the other technologies that he's touched upon after this short break. Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about Edgar Fouche, who was an avionics and electronics engineer for the US Air Force and contracted to the US Air Force, worked on black projects, secret technologies. Now, one of the systems that he was working on was a satellite communication system at Area 51, and this was in 1979. Just tell us about that, Andrew.
What had happened was he got called up by his boss to say, oh, we need you to do a job. And he said, what job was that? He says, I can't tell you, but you need to report to this office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, which he did. And then they basically, it tells this story how he ended up getting on this bus. He might have got on in a car and then went to this other location where they caught a bus, and it was to the Nevada test site. And the bus had sort of blacked out windows and everything. And there was a guy on the bus, with a gun, and they all had to be quiet and not talk to each other. And they drove out to the Nevada test site, and he wasn't, he sort of knew roughly from the type of road and the direction they were going and stuff like that. He knew that. He eventually worked out that's where it was. And then what he found out when he got there was that the person that was meant to do this job, which was on some cryptographics equipment, some communications equipment basically, the person that would normally do it had a bereavement, and so he'd had to take leave for a few days. And so Ed was called up because he was very well qualified and he was trusted. He was called up to do the work instead, and he didn't have to they didn't put him under oath that he wouldn't reveal what he did, presumably because it was done at short notice, and it was only I think he called it temporary duty. He was on temporary duty at this thing. And one of the things that he clearly said was, when he got off the bus, they had to put on these goggles which would blur your vision, so you could only see enough in front of you to walk so you didn't trip over things, and your vision outside of that was completely obscured, so he couldn't see what was there. So, but he was led into this building, and led to where the equipment was. And this, as I say, was in 1979. And eventually he was there for 10 days. So I think the first couple of days he was kind of orientating himself to the equipment. And then I think he had a problem, fixed the problem, and then the problem recurred. And so he had to go back again. So he ended up being there for 10 days.
So this was a satellite communication system.
That's
right. Probably a
right.
box of electronics, some kind of transponder or something like that, which is sending data up to a satellite.
Up to a satellite, that's right. And so he basically had to pull the cards out of a rack, and he looked at these cards and he described, you know, and I put a little picture in the video I did with what's called a VLSI chip, very large scale integration, which is a very advanced type of silicon chip, and this was, you could see the technology was quite a way in advance of what he was used to in other systems. And he had an oscilloscope and I think a frequency meter or frequency counter, and he pulled out this particular card as the one that wasn't working properly, and he put the probes onto the appropriate points on the card, and he looked at the blueprint for the card, the spec sheets, worked out where the test points were, and when he put this onto his scope, he realised two things. The first thing was that the processor was running at 1 gigahertz. And when he looked at the actual signal that was coming off the card and going into the transmitter and receiver, it was running at a frequency which was for voice signal. In other words, it was a higher frequency. It wasn't just for telemetry. You know, normally for telemetry you use a lower frequency signal, and for voice you use a higher frequency. Just
explain the significance of the 1 gigahertz, Andrew. So the 1 gigahertz is, I think it's 1,000 million cycles a second.
That's right.
And if you put an oscilloscope on a test point on a piece of digital electronics, the microprocessor will run at a clock speed.
That's right.
And that is the fastest part of that board. You won't get a signal which changes faster than the clock speed, because everything is derived from the clock speed.
That's right.
And it decides how the whole thing operates. It's like everything's taking its speed from the clock speed.
That's right.
So just tell us what year 1 gigahertz processors were in the commercial world.
Yeah, well, in the commercial world, they started to have the 1 gigahertz Pentium about 1999.
And this is in 1979.
Yes.
But he thinks the kit might have been probably manufactured
4 or 5 years old.
75.
Yeah.
So it's 25 years ahead in terms of speed.
Yeah. So he'd never seen anything like that, and this thing was called the DOSL, the Direct Orbital Code Link, I think was what it was called, and he picked up this in conversations in the mess hall and the canteen, because they had good food there. You know, he said they had to make the food good there because it was not a very good place to work. You know, because it was out in the desert, and you were away from home for a long time and so on, and you couldn't really talk to anyone much. But one of the things when he was looking at this card, as I said, he realised that there was this voice signal, and he was thinking, well, if this is a voice signal, who are they talking to up in space? Because remember, this is 79, so not only have we only got, like in 79 we had the Commodore PET, and we just about had the Sinclair, and the Sinclair ZX80 ran at I think 3.5 megahertz. So it's it's about 500 times, 400 times slower than this other card. So he was thinking, well, who are we talking to up in space? And of course, the first space shuttle flight I think was 1981, so before the space shuttle. So what's going on? Yeah.
Now with all of these contacts that he had, because he worked with pilots, because he was commissioning a lot of the avionics kit on the aircraft, on secret aircraft. Yeah. So he's going to work with pilots, test pilots, and this kind of thing. So one of the pilots that he spoke to has had a theory that UFOs are attracted to some of these extremely fast aircraft because they go up and have a look at them. So we're just going to have a look at a clip from a talk that Ed gave in 1998, where he describes what this pilot told him about this particular UFO sighting.
He has a theory that UFOs seem to like fast aircraft. This SR-71 pilot, Doc, was stationed at Kadena Air Force Base, Okinawa, where the SR-71s were stationed on the SAC side of the base back in 1973. In fact, I think they still are. I was there last time in '81. While flying back across the South China Sea from a reconnaissance mission, he encountered a shadow over his cockpit. Doc said his avionics systems went totally haywire and he felt the aircraft nose down slightly, which can be dangerous at 2,000 miles an hour or 35 miles per minute. When he looked up, he was so startled that he almost panicked immediately. Made evasive maneuvers to his right and down, which is one of the maneuvers they make if there's a missile detected. Doc said the object was so big that it totally blanked out the sun. His estimate was it was 250 feet to 300 feet across. It was oval in shape, but he wasn't sure of the exact shape because there was a shimmering halo of energy surrounding the vehicle. About 3 minutes later, and some thousands of feet lower, the vehicle reappeared on his left wingtip. He tried his UHF, and all he could pick up was a deep electrical hum. He abandoned his attempts, made evasive maneuvers, and for the next 10 minutes, this thing moved about his aircraft effortlessly and stayed right on top of him. Doc said and I'm going to quote him exactly, Doc said he got this sound in his head, and his words were, like a swarm of bees in my brain, which is, it's an interesting, must be an interesting sound. The aircraft would move from the left to the right wingtip of his aircraft. It would take about 2 minutes to move back and forth. When Doc returned from his mission, it was the same routine as the earlier incident I told you about. His commander drug him down to his office the minute he opened his mouth about the incidents and gave him a direct order not to talk about it or they'd throw the book at him.
You know, it's the usual story, really, that he knows various people that have had sightings, such as that one, and they're all obviously told not to talk about it. I mean, there's one particular one that we discussed, which you and I haven't discussed, Richard. It was an F-15, which crashed into a hillside during a test flight, and that there was a large UFO sighting associated with that crash, and there's quite a lot of information about that which hasn't been put out much. Right. So he has talked about various pilots that have had encounters, and the sorts of circles he was moving in. These were pilots of highly specified test aircraft, or even secret aircraft, like as I say the SR-71.
He said he didn't know one test pilot or SR-71 pilot or astronaut, and he can name most of them and give you their birthdays and their wives' names and tell you where they lived. He said he didn't know one that hadn't had some type of contact. But he also said he didn't know one that would ever come forward and be honest about their experiences for fear of retaliation from the government. You have to realize these people's pensions, which includes their livelihood, their medical coverage, their commissary and BX privileges, the government controls all that.
Another word that we often hear connected with US secret aircraft is the Aurora. And Ed explains that the Aurora is not a craft, it is a whole project of lots of different airplanes. So just tell us a bit about that, Andrew, and in particular the SR-75.
Yeah, so the SR-75, this was a high-speed, top-secret aircraft, and it could travel up to 120,000 feet altitude and go at Mach 5 times the speed of sound, which would go between Nevada and Russia in 3 hours, as a return mission.
And this is in the 1970s?
This is in the 70s, yeah.
All right. Now, another thing that he mentions is the SR-74, which couldn't take off itself on a normal runway, but would be piggybacked and could actually get into space.
That's right. So he said that the SR-75 was a launcher for the SR-74, and the SR-74 could go up to 151 miles, which of course is, the space shuttle was typically around about 130 miles, I think, something like that.
151 miles altitude above the Earth. Yeah,
correct.
So is that in space?
It's in orbit.
In orbit. So it's in orbit. So in what year we're talking about for the SR-74?
Again, we're talking about sort of 1970s.
Right. So in the 1970s, we've got a plane that can go in orbit. When on our TV screens we're all watching. Well, the space shuttle wasn't even invented then, was it?
Well, they were developing it then.
They were developing it, but we had the Apollo missions, sitting watching a rocket 10, 9, 8, 7, and we all think that's technology amazing that can get into space, but they've got, the Air Force have got a plane that can go in space.
Right, that's it. I mean, he points this out, that the space shuttle, NASA got this sort of hand-me-down technology from the NSA.
The SR-74 can't take off from the ground. It has to be on top of the SR-75 above 100,000 feet altitude. Then it can attain orbital altitudes. The SCRAMP launches ferret satellites for the National Security Agency that weigh 2,000 pounds or less and measure 6 feet by 5 feet. But as you can imagine, the old satellites that were big as a van, you can pretty much now make one about the size of a briefcase, so you don't need booster rockets. The NASA Space Shuttle, I'm here to tell you, is really an antique by comparison. The joke is on us. Yep. If you think these rumors are far-fetched, look at the YB-49 and the XB-70, flown in 1948 and 1964, respectively. Now look at the SR-75, which has been spotted numerous times. You say the government can't keep a secret? Boy, you're wrong. There's new rumors from my sources. 2 new vehicles have been placed in permanent orbit. One of these vehicles is the Space Orbital Nuclear Service Intercept Vehicle, SUNCIV. When you hear it from another reliable source in 10 years, you'll remember this. It's codenamed Locust. The SR-74 and the TR3B flying triangle can deliver spares, replacement units, service fuels, chemicals, and modules to the SUNCIV, or Locust. The robotic SUNCIV uses deliverables to service, calibrate, repair, and replace parts on the newer NSA, CIA, and NRO ferret satellites. And I know for a fact that they were developing robotic repair of electronics equipment as far back as '81, because I worked a program to where they didn't want technicians looking at the equipment.
Now, he's mentioned the TR3B there, Andrew, which we're going to come on to, but just to comment on what he said there, that the NSA have got satellites and technology that they can fly to and from, satellites that are completely undisclosed to the American government or the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that these are things that are in orbit that no one apart from the NSA, they're completely secret, and they're being used for God knows what.
Yeah, and I mean this presentation that we're showing clips from, it's 1998.
Yeah.
So we're already, 15, 16 years on from that.
Yeah. So what have they got up there now?
Well, they'd worked out by that time the way that this, anti-gravity propulsion or gravity field warping, we're still not quite sure what to call it, and it operated on the principle of a rotating magnetic field, and it used a mercury plasma. So they, as you say, they'd set up this inner tube or this torus or this donut-shaped unit and powered it all up, and they chained it all down because they felt it was going to take off. And he relates this story that was told to him.
Another friend who worked for General Dynamics in Fort Worth described a program in which he worked at a plasma accelerator in the mid-60s, researching gravity warping techniques. He is a physicist by education and trade. This was his first top secret program. He described a foil-like material, much like that discovered after Roswell crash. He described the foil as 12 layers of material less than 10,000ths of an inch thick. It was as flexible as a plastic trash bag, but virtually indestructible to piercing, burning, or cutting, which you've probably all heard before. Here's what you haven't heard. In order to cut the material used for the project, the material was supercooled, a large electrical charge was applied to polarize the molecular structure, and a laser cutter was applied in order to cut this material. Large ribbons of this material were used to reinforce the accelerator, which contained the mercury-based plasma that they started researching in 1965. The plasma was cooled to superconductive temperatures, rotated at 45,000 revolutions per minute, and pressurized at 150,000 atmospheres. This would be considered state-of-the-art technology even today.
Okay, so just to describe that, you've got a mercury-based plasma. Plasma is like a gas which has become ionized, if you like, and it's being rotated at 40,000 or higher revolutions per minute. Now, what that suggests to me is you've got something which is highly conductive, can conduct electricity, which is whizzing round, charged. That is a current. It's an electric current going around in a circle, right? So what you're going to get, every electric current, if a current goes that way, it has a magnetic field going around that way. So you're going to get a magnetic field going around this donut, and it's going to be a field with probably some absolutely phenomenal strength, a phenomenal flux density, higher than you could get with copper or passing electricity down a wire. So you've got this phenomenally large magnetic field, but as Ed describes it as more of a vortex field, so not only is it doing that, it's possibly got a twist in it as well.
Yeah.
And this highly intense magnetic vortex field is what somehow disrupts gravity.
Yeah.
Because physicists will generally agree that all forces are unified at some level.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, that's my understanding, is along the lines that you've just described. And I mean, you know, going back to some of the other things that I've come across in relation to that, Wilbur Smith in the early 60s, he'd said that the information he'd got led him to believe that gravity and magnetism were interrelated, and gravity was actually a result of, you know, changing magnetic fields within objects. And then also you look at, for example, the Nazi bell, the stories about the Nazi bell, that was meant to use a rotating mercury-based plasma as well. Similarly, the Vimanas, the ancient Vimanas in the Vedic scripts, the Vimanaka Shastra also talks about a mercury plasma. So it appears that, you know, mercury is important because of it's a very unusual element, mercury, because it's liquid. It's the only metal that's liquid at room temperature, and there's, you know, and it's very dense as well. So what is it about mercury? Obviously, something very special about it, and it can be used perhaps in a form of a plasma to create a magnetic field. You know, to create an anti-gravity field.
And as Fouche says in that clip, everything that was inside this huge donut was lost 50% of its mass or its weight, or if it was on a pair of scales, it would be 50% of what it should have weighed.
Right.
Which they're then going to try and develop into getting it off the ground.
The original TR3B was 200 feet across, the prototype. It was codenamed Astra, and I was just informed by Jeff Rentz when I did his radio show that Astra has connections all the way back to the Indian flying vehicles several thousand years ago, which is interesting. They codenamed it Astra. The tactical reconnaissance TR3B first flight was in the early 90s. The triangular-shaped, nuclear-powered aerospace platform was developed under the top-secret Aurora program. By 1994, there were $3 billion-plus operational models. The operational model is 600 feet across. This flying triangle is not fiction. If you don't believe me, ask the tens of thousands of people who have now spotted one version or another of it, from Belgium to England. Ken can tell you about people who have seen it in England to Arizona. The TR3B vehicle's outer coating is reactive to electrical radar stimulation and can change reflectiveness, radar absorptiveness, and color. The polymer skin, when used in conjunction with electronics countermeasures and ECCM, can make the vehicle look like a small aircraft, flying cylinder, or even trick radar receivers into falsely detecting a variety of aircraft, an aircraft in another location, multiple aircraft, or no aircraft at all. The circular plasma field accelerator ring, called the magnetic field disruptor, surrounds a rotatable crew compartment. It's far ahead of anything you've ever imagined as far as technology. Sandia and Livermore Laboratories developed a reverse engineered MFD, and I believe the government will go at any lengths to protect this technology. But you're not going to be able to build one of these from what I tell you, nor am I. So the government will go to any lengths. Believe me, the plasma in this accelerator is mercury-based. It's pressurized at 250,000 atmospheres at a temperature of 150 degrees Kelvin, superconductivity, and accelerated to 60,000 revolutions per minute to create a superconductive plasma with the resulting gravity energy. The MFD generates a magnetic vortex field which disrupts and neutralizes the effects of gravity on mass within proximity by 89%. Do not misunderstand, this is not anti-gravity. Anti-gravity you can use as a propulsive force. The mass of the circular accelerator and all the mass within the accelerator, such as the crew compartment, avionics, MFD systems, fuels, environmental systems, and nuclear reactor, are reduced by 89%. This causes the effect of making the aircraft extremely light and able to outperform any aircraft yet constructed, except of course those we didn't build. TR3B is a high-altitude stealth reconnaissance platform with indefinite loiter time. Once you get it up there at speed, it doesn't take much propulsion to maintain altitude. With the vehicle's mass reduced by 89%, the vehicle can travel at Mach 9 vertically or horizontally. So for those that have had sightings of things making right, and they're not perfect right turns, obviously. Nothing can make a perfect right turn. It's against the laws of physics. But it sure looks like a right turn at a distance. For those that have seen it, that's how they do it. The TR3B uses 3 multimode thrusters mounted on each corner of the triangular platform. The multimode propulsion system can operate in the atmosphere with thrust provided by the nuclear reactor, and in the upper atmosphere with hydrogen propulsion, and in orbit with combined hydrogen and oxygen propulsion. The original picture of the TR3B was taken with a digital camera that was carried on a special operations C-130 out of Hurlburt Field. It was flying mission support for the TR3B. The current picture, by the way, that was developed with 3D Studio from that digital picture hangs in the Black Vault at Lockheed.
So the US Air Force and the NSA have got 600 feet wide platforms that can take off from a standing start silently, travel into space and back, and who knows where in the solar system or even outside of the solar system. They've had these, or a fleet of these, since the early 1990s, and they've told no one about them. So wake up, folks. The space shuttle and the Apollo programs were diversions to stop you from realizing what the US Air Force has been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. So you want to comment, Andrew?
Yeah, I couldn't really put it better than that. I mean, I do think that all the Apollo program and the similar programs were a distraction, and they were to soak up, the relevant amount of expertise and curiosity about space travel, and that all helps to keep the focus away from all the black programs such as the TR3B, and I think, as Ed will talk about, there are probably others which we don't really know about.
And what he says about the development of the craft, they only managed to get it to reduce its weight by 89%.
Yeah.
Therefore, they put it inside a triangle and put thrusters on the 3 corners of the triangle, which use hydrogen propulsion or hydrogen oxygen propulsion.
Yeah.
So it's got these jets on the 3 corners in order to reduce that last bit of weight or get it off the ground, and also propel it. And he alleges that it's capable of Mach 9, did he say?
Yeah, I think Mach 9.
Mach 9, that's 9 times the speed of sound, either vertically or horizontally.
Yeah.
And I think Ed is fairly convinced that the TR3B is what was witnessed in the Belgian UFO sightings.
Yeah.
This was in 1990, I think.
Yeah, 89, I think, or 1990.
89 or 1990. So they were flying them around Belgium and parts of Europe, and the Air Force were chasing them.
Yep. As you've reported on your documentary, Richard, this is partly why I got in touch with you about this, because I think it ties in with your almost identified flying objects in the documentary at some level. We don't know, but if you look at what the witnesses that you have in that documentary described, you can see a pretty strong similarity to what Edgar Fouche describes. And we've got to remember that Edgar Fouche disclosed this information in '98, so it was way before your documentary came out, way before you and I were really into this material.
So we're not saying that there's some unexplained or possibly non-human element to some UFO cases. What we're saying is that some of the triangular ones we're pretty sure are undisclosed craft with phenomenal technology on them. Right. Now, this is a list of questions which I think you can get from your website, Andrew, and it's the aircraft researcher Michael Schratt put some questions to Edgar Fouche, and he's answered all of them. And I'm just going to read some of them because I find the answers pretty incredible. It says that there were 3 flying that he knew of before 1994. They're used for logistics support and transportation for the Secret Space Command. If used on a planet, moon or large outpost, you would have a ready-made transportable space station.
Yeah.
So it's presumably going to the moon and possibly other planets in our solar system.
Right.
A portable space station which can probably carry vast amounts of payload.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the other term is a space platform rather than a space station, in that, you know, you can, a platform, obviously you can launch other things from it, or you can use it as a support vehicle for other, you know, other craft. We talked about quasicrystals, which are this unusual type of metamaterial, and they can use this to create optical stealth or radar stealth. And he describes in the presentation there, I think he called it an electrochromatic coating, which, you know, that name suggests to me that by applying a particular voltage to this material, you can change the reflectivity or the colour to match, you know, maybe the colour of the sky that you're in, so you can give it some measure of stealth. Now, again, go and look at quasicrystals, look at the web page, and as Ed told me, a man called Dan, I think it was Dan Shechtman, he won the Nobel Prize, I think, for chemistry or physics in 2011. I mentioned this in the videos, for his work on quasicrystals. But originally, when he started his research, he was, you know, he was vilified for it. He was lambasted, and so it appears that this is one of those areas of research which perhaps they didn't want people looking into a few years ago, because the military had their own version of it and wanted to keep that secret. Whereas now they've probably got something, you know, much better, so they don't mind that the white world quasicrystal research has started to catch up a bit. And this has been a running theme. A lot of the things that Ed has said, and he makes quite a strong point about this. He was saying them in 1998, and at that time they were quite kind of science fiction. But things like quasicrystals, as you say, and some of the plasma physics, they've since kind of advanced in the white world to many of the, you know, sort of areas that Ed was talking about in '98.
And we featured another whistleblower who mentioned plasma physics, who claimed that they had craft that had been to Mars in a previous show.
Yeah, that's right.
Because assuming all this is true, and I suspect that it is, because I think Ed Fouche is a 100% genuine guy. He's produced hundreds of documents to verify his credibility. As you said, he took part in a Channel 4 documentary in what year?
It was filmed in '98.
98. But he was only featured for about 3 minutes.
That's right.
Like an hour and a half long.
Well, it was actually, the whole thing was it was called Riddle of the Skies. People may be familiar with it, some of the, you know, longer time viewers. And it was 3 hours, or, you know, 3 hours airtime, but obviously about 3 times 45 minutes, you know, total running time. Yeah.
So any genuine media organisation worth its salt that come across Ed Fouche should be making a 3 hour long documentary about his.
Yeah, well, I did.
Yeah, but they've just played it down.
Yeah.
They've given him a little bit of airtime. They've taken photographs of all his documents and what have you. And even the alternative media, it appeared at the time, didn't seem that interested.
No.
For example, the Art Bell show. Just tell us what happened there.
Well, that's right. I mean, he in '98 came out with these disclosures. They tried. Somebody asked him to go on Coast to Coast, and then, you know, he was contacted to say, oh, they cancelled it because of a scheduling problem, and then he was rescheduled, and they cancelled it again. And he was never on Coast to Coast. He never ended up being on there, despite this very powerful and very well backed information.
One thing that's always intrigued me about this sort of technology, you're talking 600 feet triangle, right? It's got to be being kept somewhere. Now, it may be that there's a whole fleet of them on the backside of the moon, and that's where they're parked up.
Maybe.
But he's asked that question by Michael Schratt. He says he thinks that they might be kept underwater somewhere or under the ground. Now, he has spoken about underground facilities. Just tell us a bit about what he said about EG&G and their development of underground bases at Area 51 and places like that.
Well, he has become aware of some of these facilities. I mean, we talked about this a lot in our videos, or a fair bit, and I can't remember all the details off the top of my head now, but I do remember that he worked at underground facilities at Edwards Air Force Base, and there was another one where they had a lot of these golf ball dishes. I'm trying to remember where that was, and he discovered that there was an underground facility there which he went to work in, and he describes going into this tunnel where they had to go to service some equipment, and then there were other tunnels going off of it, and there was a security door with a panel where you put a code in to get into this other area. So he knew that it went off into other areas that he wasn't given access to. So it was big. In other words, it was bigger than the part that he was in. So he worked in several underground facilities, mainly, well, in fact, all were associated with Air Force bases.
They've got these vehicles which can get into space quite easily, probably with not vast amounts of fuel, because they've got this special magnetic field disruptor which negates gravity. They can probably take trips quite easily to and from neighbouring planets and the moon and this kind of thing. So can we just postulate as to what might be going on now? Because, as you said, his information is from 94, 95, and that's his latest information. So there's a fleet of these 600 feet wide secret aircraft that can silently come and go from space and probably into parts of the solar system. What's your guess, Andrew?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting, because there was one of the things that Ed mentioned to me recently, just after we did the interviews, was there was this History Channel documentary, and that was on quite recently, sort of, I think it was sort of March 2014, and that talked about a project called, I think, Solar Guardian, which was basically, Solar Guardian was the secret program, or one branch of the secret space program, and that talked about various craft that could travel through the solar system and so on. And if you watch that program, which somebody might have stuck on YouTube, you can probably get it, somehow off the internet. This chap that we've mentioned, Michael Schratt, he's in that program, and they actually talk about the TR3B, but Ed's name is not mentioned at all in the History Channel documentary, which I thought was a bit peculiar. But I do think that this has been developed into a fleet. It may be that
that would tie up with Gary McKinnon's claims.
Yes, exactly. Ed was saying it was a space platform, so maybe there is other technology. Because remember, Ed was only in contact with 6 or 7 main people. There will be other black programs as well, which he didn't have any information about. So I would certainly say that there is a secret space program. It's advanced from where the TR3B was. I was talking to somebody in the US in 2008, and they said that somebody they knew had been working on space platforms in the 50s.
Now, one question that always comes to my mind when we start disclosing this kind of information, you think, well, it all seems to be the US secret space program, the NSA, the CIA, the US Air Force. What about what must China be doing or thinking? Because they've got to know. You would have thought, with a country like, say, China or Russia, or countries which we think are independent of the US, but are they really? Is this a world conspiracy, or is it just the United States?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's always very tricky because, as you said, essentially most of the information that's like this we get from the US. We get maybe a little bit from Europe and the UK. But yeah, exactly. What is China doing? Maybe we're having a problem because there's a language barrier, so we don't get to hear what's going on in China because there's a language barrier. The other aspect is that it is said that there is a world organisation which is a custodian of this information, with the US at the top. And if you essentially pay your dues to the US in some way, in other words, you'll fall into line with what the people who run in the US want, the people in the shadows, not Barack Obama, then you'll be given access to certain information. In other words, they'll give you some access to this sort of technology.
It's incredible that this technology exists, because if we just think of modern air travel, people getting on jets and cramped sitting there on international travel, when they could all probably just walk into something which is 1,000 feet wide and have a bed or whatever, and it just lifts up and it's there.
Yeah.
It travels at Mach 9, so you can be in Australia in a few hours. And probably have your own room or whatever on this huge craft. You know, that's what travel could be if they release this technology.
Absolutely.
But you think there's people actively trying to cover up and discredit the information so that it doesn't get out. Just tell us about that.
Anti-gravity is one of those technologies, coupled with the free energy technology, which would completely transform the world that we live in. It would change everything. You know, we wouldn't need roads, we wouldn't need the conventional air travel. It would change everything if we had anti-gravity generators, you know, to use in our everyday lives. It'd change construction, you know, it'd change everything. And I've come to the conclusion that, you know, the sorts of things we've been talking about are leakages in the secrecy, and they've got to be managed. And one, you know, take I have on this is because of this character called Alien Scientist, who is actually a fellow by the name of Jeremy Riss, who's had quite a popular YouTube channel. And it was actually because of this Alien Scientist that was how I came into contact with Ed Fouche, because Alien Scientist had been publishing hit piece videos on Dr. Judy Wood, who many people have heard me talk about with you, and we've all talked about that extensively. And he'd posted some hit pieces on her on his YouTube channel, and then I noticed that the presentation that we've been watching bits of, 1998, I'd never seen that up until a couple of years ago. Even though it was filmed in 98, it wasn't available on the internet, and it popped up on Alien Scientist's YouTube channel, which I thought was a bit peculiar. And I wrote to Ed Fouche through YouTube, and I said, well, I don't think this Alien Scientist character has been totally honest. I think he's up to something. I think he's, you know, helping the cover up. And ultimately it was Ed that wrote to me, because he'd become unhappy with what this Alien Scientist was doing with the information that Ed had given Alien Scientist, Jeremy Riss. And so Ed had sort of Ed contacted me, and we mutually decided to do these lengthy interviews. So, and of course the anti-gravity connection to 9/11 is the research of John Hutchison, who's also produced anti-gravity type effects with some of his experiments. And the Alien Scientist character had stuff about John Hutchison on his channel, and he also had stuff about another fellow we haven't mentioned yet called Eugene Podkletnov, who's I think from one of the Eastern Bloc countries, and he developed a force beam, which you and I were talking about yesterday, where if you could have a force beam, in other words like a force of gravity that you could direct down to the ground, for example from something like a TR3B, it would act like a, you know, a tripod leg, even though there's nothing physically there, and you could eventually prop this craft up on a force beam. And
or you could fire it at the moon and push yourself along.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, you could use it to, or you could have two beams, one firing at the ground and one off the moon or something, and then propel yourself in a given direction. And it was Podkletnov that had discovered this, and that was also this Podkletnov video suddenly surfaced on Alien Scientist channel. I wondered where he got all these from. So it looked like he'd become a, you know, host for all this information, keeping it in one place.
And then putting a debunking spin on it.
Well, when he needed to. I mean, he did that with Ed eventually. He eventually put debunking stuff about Ed on his channel.
All right then, Andrew, thanks again for your comments. Fascinating stuff as usual. And it just remains for me to say, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.